Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome to another episode of The Odd Vlog. I've literally just watched The Marvels for the first time, so this is my immediate reaction to that movie. So let's get into it. Now, right off the bat, I will say that I really wanted to like this film, particularly because someone who means a lot to me actually really enjoyed the film, so I kind of wanted to feel the same way. I wanted to like it and I wanted to enjoy it. So if we focus on the positives of the movie to start with, it's a very fun movie. It's a very fun, light-hearted, there's a lot of comedy in it. It doesn't take itself too seriously. And in some ways, I think that's probably a good thing because over the past few years, we've had things like, you know, Avengers Infinity War and Endgame that have been very heavy movies. They've been so emotionally heavy that it's kind of nice actually to have something that is a lot more light-hearted, a very light film. It doesn't take itself that seriously. And because of that, it's a little easier to watch. It's a lot more fun. And it focuses on that quite a lot rather than it being, you know, this big emotional thing that becomes quite a heavy thing for an audience to watch. So from that perspective, if that's the kind of thing you want to watch in a movie, then obviously that's going to tick the box for you. And in some ways, it's quite nice where I like the emotional heavy Marvel movies with things like Infinity War, but it is quite nice to have a bit of a break from that, because if you go down that road too much, it almost becomes probably a little bit too dark and a bit too DC. So for this to be a lot lighter and a lot funnier, yeah, it's okay. If that's what you want in a film, then obviously it works really well on that level. The thing is as well is that because of that, I feel like Ms. Marvel, she kind of steals the show a little bit because she delivers the humour really, really well in this, whereas the other two obviously characters with Captain Marvel and Monica Rambeau, they're more serious in what they're doing and in their tone and the way they speak and act and that kind of thing, which is great because it means you get good contrast, and it means that Ms. Marvel is then able to provide that humour element and kind of take the audience with her on that kind of journey. So it works really well on that front to have those three characters that are very different in the way that they present themselves and their tone and how they act. Means you get a nice blend of all of it. But there are times where I feel like Captain Marvel is perhaps trying to be funny, but it's more with her, it's a bit more situational comedy, and I'll get onto one of those particular scenes later on. But with her, she's sort of somewhere between being really serious and sometimes being really funny, and it's sort of a little bit not quite sure where you stand with her. But with Ms. Marvel, she's always funny, and it actually really works. It's a good performance. It's well done. So yeah, from that performance, from that side of things, the performance and the comedy of that and in that character does actually work really, really well. I liked that. Captain Marvel, I think, of the three characters is the one that's probably trying to be the most serious and the most kind of emotionally impactful throughout the show, throughout the film, sorry. And it's probably because of the fact that the reason why the story is happening and why the bad guy is doing what they're doing is because of when Captain Marvel, at the end of her solo movie, goes off to go and fight the Supreme Intelligence. And in doing so, in kind of defeating the Kree, ends up basically destroying their home world, ripping it of its resources, of its environment, of its atmosphere, and turning it into a bit of a dead planet. And she feels very obviously responsible for that. It wasn't what she was trying to do. She was trying to free them and liberate them from this essentially AI program that was kind of ruling their whole world. But in doing so, ends up really destroying them, and obviously feels the weight and the guilt of that. And because of that, her storyline throughout the movie, and for her amongst those three main characters, hers is the more serious in tone. There's obviously a lot of regret and a lot of remorse and all these kinds of things that should be heavy emotionally, but I kind of feel like it doesn't really work so much. You don't feel the weight of anything simply because the film is so lighthearted and so funny that it doesn't really come across when she's trying to do the serious scenes, because you're just not emotionally invested in the film to be able to feel what she's feeling. And it's not that she doesn't portray it very well, I just feel like it's not written for that kind of scene. It just doesn't really kind of work. So there are emotional reasons as to why she is the way she is and what she's doing, but you just don't feel the weight of it. And it's the comedy that kind of pulls you through that whole film, really, to keep it lighthearted, to keep it entertaining, and to focus on that as being the main drive. So the fact that there is an emotional element behind the scenes is only really there to tell the story. It doesn't give you anything emotionally, but that's fine. I mean, if that's obviously the direction that they were going in, that's the result of what happens, and ultimately that's what you get. You just left with something that is lighthearted and is more of a fun watch than anything else. And therein does lie one of the first problems that I had with this movie, is the fact that this whole idea that Captain Marvel, at the end of her film, she goes off to fight the Supreme Intelligence, and you never really get that story. You don't get to really see it. There's like some flashback scenes that tell you what happened, and you see it for all of about 30 seconds on screen, if that. And there's this whole storyline that you've not been told, you don't really get to see as an audience, and you genuinely get the impression, or certainly I did, that that was probably what was supposed to be Captain Marvel 2. That was the storyline that they were going to tell, how she had gone off and tried to defeat the Supreme Intelligence, and then the aftermath of that maybe would lead into the Marvels after that. So it was almost as though they'd kind of skipped the story, they'd skipped her story. And I can't help but think that that's got something to do with Brie Larson, and obviously what she brings to Marvel Studios is quite often, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I'm just saying that obviously she does bring some negativity with her, rightly or wrongly, and I got nothing against her myself, but you know, if you've got Brie Larson in the film, that for Marvel at least, there's going to be backlash, and I feel like maybe they decided to drop Captain Marvel 2 and sort of accelerate the story making to go into the Marvels instead, to not bypass the character, but to just reduce the amount that she's obviously in it. She's now sharing the spotlight with 3 characters instead of just being on her own, and kind of skipping what would have been her sequel story. I personally, I would have rather a Captain Marvel 2. I would rather have seen that story. I'm not interested in any of the drama that's behind Brie Larson. I honestly don't care. So I would have wanted to have seen that story. I like Captain Marvel as a character, so I would have wanted to have seen that, and I have no problem with Brie Larson. So I would have wanted a proper sequel for her, for that character, to see that story going up against the Kree, and to kind of seen that. That was the story that I would have wanted to see. But instead, you do get the impression that they've skipped over that, jumped straight for what would have potentially been like the trilogy, and gone straight for the finish, which was all 3 of them together as the Marvels. Now, whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing, I don't know, but that is the decision that they've obviously gone down and the route that they've taken. And by the end of the movie, it's then setting up other things and other characters and other franchises. So it's almost as though I can genuinely see Captain Marvel not turning up anymore, which I think is a shame, because I do think she's a cool character and you could do some really good things and some great stories with her. So it is a bit of a shame, but my first complaint, obviously, for the Marvels is simply the fact that you're showing us a story that you could have told, but you chose not to because you're just letting politics get in the way of proper storytelling. So for me, I feel quite bad about that, because there's a film there that I would have wanted to see, and now I never will. I know what happens now in terms of the character and where she goes and what happens after her first solo movie. I wanted to see that sequel, so I think it's a real shame. One of the other things that I feel was not so good about the Marvels, there are 2 scenes in particular where I know they're trying to keep it lighthearted and funny and everything, but they were unbelievably gimmicky. The first of it is going to a planet where they only communicate by singing, which means that the entire movie starts turning into a musical all of a sudden. And there was genuinely a moment where I was like, what am I watching? Because it suddenly just gets stupid. I mean, there's funny and there's comedy and there's humour, but then there's stupidity. And that scene, that really lost me completely, because it was just daft. It's just such a gimmick. I mean, I'm like, I don't understand why people think that that's funny. It's not funny. It's just awkward and embarrassing. And I'm like, you're trying to tell stories of superheroes and kind of make it believable, and engage with your audience, and instead you turn it into a joke. And a film can be funny without being a joke itself, of itself. But that scene and the whole singing planet thing, I hated that. I mean, it's just, yeah, it's a gimmick. That's all it is. It's just a gimmick. And then you kind of do the same thing again by turning the movie into a film about cats. And honestly, it's just another gimmick. It's like, oh, we're all gonna die, we're all gonna, be in peril, and what's gonna save us? A load of cats. And okay, fine, they're Flerkens, not cats, but it's a cat at the end of the day. You're scene after scene after scene of endless cats and kittens running around, going for the funny approach with the music that they're using and all that kind of thing. You're being saved by cats. I mean, this is as bad as what was happening in Love and Thunder. Don't go down this road of being stupid. It's stupid. It's not funny. It's not entertaining. It's daft. And, you know, maybe for like the first 10 or 20 seconds, like the screaming goats in Love and Thunder, they were funny the first time. After a few seconds, it just becomes nothing but irritating. And again, I'm watching it thinking, why am I watching a movie about cats running around saving the world? It just gets ridiculous. And I mean, like, those two scenes of the singing and of the cats really detract from the rest of the film. They really kind of, whatever emotional level you had with this film is immediately lost because of these really stupid gimmicks. And it's playing on old jokes now as well, because when you saw Goose the first time round, being a Flerken and the whole tentacle eating people thing, that as a joke at the time was quite funny. But even that, when they first did it, was a rip-off of basically Guardians of the Galaxy and Groot. It's exactly the same scene, but with just a different creature. So you've done it once in Guardians of the Galaxy, and it was hilarious. You've done it a second time in Captain Marvel, where it is exactly the same thing. All right, it's still funny. Now you're doing it for a third time, and you're just going nuts with it. It's not funny anymore. It's not funny anymore. And that is why, for me, as far as the comedy and the humour and everything like that goes, it's still Ms. Marvel that is stealing the show. And she really stands out as being the funniest character in there and the funniest thing in the entire film. So it's just those two scenes will be stuck in my head forever as just being, what am I watching? So moving on to just like a couple of other aspects that were in it, and we'll look at the kind of what I think is a bit of an overall problem with Marvel movies, and it has been ever since day one, and that's the villain problem. They have a problem with villains in the Marvel universe, certainly in the cinematic universe, in the fact that a villain will come along and they only last one movie and then they're gone again. And it's okay in the sense that you've got Thanos, who's kind of the big bad behind the scenes in the first saga. And now arguably you're supposed to have Kang going on behind the scenes in the second one. Okay, they're fine. They're the big bads, if you like, which just means that whatever villain turns up in these other movies is just, you know they're not going to last. You know they're going to be defeated. You know that they're not in it for the long haul. So they kind of lose any gravity, and it's been that same problem right from the early days. It's nothing new, this whole villain thing. And the same thing applies in the Marvels as well. It's a villain that comes along, decent backstory, kind of get it, kind of understand why they're doing what they're doing, but arguably you know they're not going to see out the film, and that's exactly what happens. They get defeated, and in the end quite easily. So it's kind of just, they're weak. They're very, very weak villains, and it's been a problem for Marvel for a very long time, and that problem just continues in this film as well. It does beg the question as well as to why they're not using these movies as an opportunity to involve Kang, and I understand why now you can't because of Jonathan Majors, but that wasn't a problem when this film came out. There was talk at one point in the film, I remember there was basically a hole in time and space and all this kind of thing, and they were talking about, you know, other dimensions kind of bleeding into ours or into yours or into theirs. And you kind of think, okay, well, that's great, that's cool, that's a chance for maybe a variant of Kang to come through, and this is how it's going to spark off, you know, the next big Avengers movie or the big storyline or the big problem, the big drama. And it never happens, it never comes. And that then got me thinking as to, well, this movie obviously is a bit of I'm not saying this to make it sound like a bad thing. I don't mean this in a bad way, but obviously it is a very feminist movie. It's about female superheroes teaming up, and they're only ever helped by other female superheroes. Absolutely fine. The kind of problem with that is that they then try to distance themselves from any other kind of superheroes. So a lot of the times with Marvel, and the reason why I think some of their movies and shows works really well is that they will bring in other characters as like surprise appearances, and they suddenly come and save the day at the last minute and that kind of thing. But because it's quite a pro-feminist film, you're never going to get a male superhero turning up to save the day at the end. Arguably, yeah, it shouldn't need that. I understand that. But, you know, cameos would have been great. That would have been absolutely fine. And it just never happens, and you know it's not going to happen, so you're kind of at times thinking, well, maybe Kang will show up, or, you know, maybe you'll get, I don't know, You could get any superhero. Pick a superhero off the top of your head and see if they turn up. Spider-Man, whatever, whoever it's going to be. They're just not going to happen in this film because it's pushing a particular directive, if you like. That's fine, but it's one of the things that Marvel has been quite good at and very successful with, is being able to drop characters in so that they feel a part of this bigger universe. But you always got the feeling with this movie that that was never going to happen because they were kind of suppressing that side of things. That's fine. It was just something that I kind of noticed, really, is that I was always thinking, well, so-and-so could turn up and maybe that character could come into it. And you're thinking, well, it's just not going to work. It's not going to happen because it just doesn't fit the narrative of what they're trying to do with this particular film. Two of the really good things about this movie are actually the mid and post credit scenes that happen at the end. So obviously they're not really part of the film, but they're obviously connected to the story. The first of which is, and spoiler alert, I'm just going to say it, 3, 2, 1, is that Katie Bishop basically is kind of recruited at the end by Ms. Marvel to put a team together, which is inevitably going to be the Young Avengers. And Bishop quite rightly makes the point that she's not actually a kid. But in any event, that seems to be the road that they want to go down with that character. So we're getting presumably another team up. I think I spoke about this in my last episode or the one before that. You can see the directions that they're going in with a lot of these teams. Young Avengers was always on the cards, and obviously Kamala and Ms. Marvel, that was always probably going to be one of their lead characters for the young version. And I did feel like this film was more for a younger audience, so it doesn't surprise me in a way that this is their opportunity to kind of go with the Young Avengers off the back of this. That's not a bad thing. It's fine, particularly bearing in mind that, you know, this is a Disney thing. It's obviously a very heavy Disney Plus thing. I'll come back to that again in a minute as well. But they're obviously going down this younger audience road and using Young Avengers to do that. That's fine. It's fine. It happens in the comics as well, so let's not forget that. But, you know, I would always want to say, well, okay, we'll make sure that you're also pushing something for your mature audience as well. But they are, because, you know, we've got Deadpool coming, which is obviously going to be a very mature thing. The X-Men, which we'll come on to in a minute as well. And also, you know we've got other Avengers movies and things like Blade, characters like Moon Knight. There are darker and more mature things out there. So they're really trying to spread everything out and, you know, make sure that there's something that appeals to everybody. The danger with that is, of course, that not everyone is going to like everything. So you are going to kind of alienate audiences from some things, from some projects. You know, Young Avengers isn't going to appeal to everybody. But then the more mature stuff isn't also going to appeal to everybody. And you can't please everyone, and I get that. But I felt like with certainly the first few phases of Marvel movies, it was something that was a bit more for everyone. Whereas now it's slightly more divisive. There's obviously things that they're going down or roads that they're going down where it appeals to particular audiences and not for everyone, this film included. So, okay, fine, you want to do that. The comics do it, so it's hard to really kind of say that that's a bad thing because it's exactly what happens in the comic books. So that's fine. I think that's just a direction that Marvel are going in that ultimately we as the audience either have to accept or just move on from. It's just the way that it's going to be. Disney Plus allows them to be more diverse in their storytelling and make more stuff, but it's interesting that Disney came out this week and said that they were going to make less and focus on better characters and stronger storylines. I'm all for that. But you've just set up the Young Avengers, so that's inevitably going to have to be one of those things that they now do. Otherwise, there's just going to be a great big stream of endlessly disappointed people. So I mentioned Disney Plus, so let's just get on to that. Obviously the movie didn't do particularly well. It's not a good performing movie. It was never going to be the biggest thing in the Marvel universe, so it surprises me that everyone reacts the way that they do, expecting this to be some great big thing, and then inevitably there's backlash because it's not, and because of who's in it and the drama that it causes, blah blah blah. It's a whole thing. This was never going to be a box office breaking movie, so for people to sort of say, oh, it's terrible, and that the numbers reflect that, well, it's not terrible. It's not the worst thing in the MCU by a long stretch. Love and Thunder is going to hold that mantle in my head for a long time. So is Shang-Chi, and so is the Eternals. I even forget the Eternals exists. This is nowhere near as bad as those three. So, you know, straight off the bat, I would say it's not as bad as what people make it out to be. I think people make out this film to be bad because it's like a trendy thing to do and to say. But I thought and wondered if one of the reasons why, from a genuine audience perspective, and not the trolls and not the people that just trashed it for the sake of trashing it, or people that don't like Brie, the person, not the cheese, it's almost like you've got three main characters in this film, one of which comes from previous movies, two of which come from Disney Plus shows. So in some ways, I feel like you're kind of alienating your cinema movie-going audience because they don't know who those two extra characters are. You know, unless you're an avid Disney Plus fan and you're watching all of the shows all of the time, there are people out there that only see the films. They see a Marvel movie coming out and think, oh, I want to see a Marvel movie. So straight away they're going into this not knowing who those other two characters are, and it's never really explained. This movie assumes that you have watched their shows and that you know who Monica Rambeau is from WandaVision, and it assumes that you've watched them as Marvel. And I think that is a dangerous thing to do, because to assume that your cinema audience is subscribing to Disney Plus and is aware and understands who all of these characters are, I can imagine a lot of people who don't have an agenda would have not seen this film because they're looking at the poster thinking, well, I only know who one of these three are, so who are the other two? And they don't want to subscribe to Disney Plus, so they don't want to go and find out, so they won't go and watch the film either. So I just wonder if that's a bit of a problem for them at the moment, and I feel like it's all very well having all of these Disney Plus shows and all these characters, but you are creating a problem for your cinema-going audience, which, you know, arguably that should be your main target. You know, you want box office numbers and records, well great, well you've got to target them, and you're not. You're taking Disney Plus characters and sticking them in the movie. It's not going to work. They're not the same audience. And I just genuinely hope that Disney and Marvel figure that out. The last thing I just want to get onto is something I touched on briefly, which was the X-Men, and the final post, mid, whatever you want to call it, credit scene that we saw was what I would argue is a proper introduction to the X-Men, with Monica Rambeau's character being pushed off into some alternate dimension, and basically you see Beast in Charles Xavier's lab. It's got the X on the wall, it's got the whole thing, he even talks about Charles, and it clearly is the X-Men universe. It looks exactly like the X-Men that we know it with Patrick Stewart and all the rest of it. So I feel like they've now done the introduction. I feel like we're now somewhere where the X-Men are kind of officially a part of it now. They're obviously just being, they're obviously an alternate dimension, and it was obviously always going to be that way. Timing wise, it's interesting because they've obviously done this, and then later this year we get Deadpool 3, so I wonder whether that's obviously when we see a proper kind of integration. But this was the first time that we've ever really seen a proper crossover with Monica Rambeau going into that universe. Now obviously we don't see anything else, we don't see any other X-Men, we see Beast, and that's basically it. But how amazing is it to see that? I mean, that's something that I think Marvel should have been pushing this X-Men crossover and tie-in a lot earlier, because of all of the things that people seem to be excited for what's coming with Marvel Studios and the MCU. X-Men and Fantastic Four have been right up there as being one of the kind of the two biggest things I would say that audiences have been clamoring for, and yet so far has never really been used, never really been touched on. They announced that certain projects were coming. We know that Deadpool 3 is technically tied in, but we don't really know how, and we know that they want to make X-Men movies that are part of the MCU. So you know it's coming, but they just don't talk about it. They don't mention it, they don't refer to it, they don't bring any of them in. We had that weird thing in WandaVision that just wasn't anything in the end. So you know, it's coming eventually, but they really seem to be dragging their feet with it for some reason, I don't know. So one of the most exciting things for me of this movie was not really a part of the movie. It was the post-credit scene where you see Beast there, all blue and all the rest of it, because now the X-Men are coming, and now perhaps there's something that you can actually be excited for as a Marvel fan and an MCU fan, something that the audience has wanted for a really long time, and we're this close away, and I assume and I hope that Deadpool 3 is the real catalyst that kind of throws all of these universes together, and we finally get to see those characters interacting with one another. We know obviously that Wolverine is going to be in Deadpool 3, so you know there's a glimmer of hope that maybe the MCU and Marvel Studios aren't in decline, and that there is something on the horizon that could well, hopefully, turn it into a success again. Because let's be honest, it's been on the decline. Really, I blame Disney Plus for that. But you know, ultimately, there are potentially good things coming. So there we go. That is The Marvels. Did I enjoy it? I did enjoy it. I didn't hate it. Again, it's not the worst thing that I've ever seen Marvel-wise. Is it the best thing I've ever seen? Certainly not by any means. It's just gonna sit there as being a bit of a throwaway movie, but it's a fun watch. It's light-hearted and it's entertaining. It's got some good humor in it. Just, you know, really don't expect any more than that. So with that said, and is it a terrible disappointment? Not really, because I feel like that's probably what I was expecting. I feel like it delivered on where I thought it was going to be. It could have been a lot worse, and again, it's not the worst thing in the MCU by any means. It's just not the best either. So on that sort of disappointment, but not really a disappointment, kind of a meh, it is time to end. Thank you very much for watching. Do leave a comment and let me know what you think, whether you enjoyed the movie. And with that said, I'll see you guys in the next episode.